This is not just another protest. This is not just another shooting. This is a moment that has reignited one of America's most volatile debates: immigration enforcement, use of force, and the limits of state power. What happened in Minneapolis has shaken communities, divided public opinion, and placed federal law enforcement under intense scrutiny. Here is the full story. The city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, a place long associated with civic activism and social movements, once again found itself at the center of national and international attention. In late January 2026, a federal immigration enforcement operation escalated into a deadly confrontation, triggering mass protests, violent unrest, and a sweeping federal investigation. What began as a routine law enforcement action quickly evolved into a flashpoint that exposed deep fractures in American society. According to federal authorities, agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE, were conducting an operation related to immigration enforcement in North Minneapolis. Details surrounding the objective of the operation have not been fully disclosed, but officials maintain it was lawful and authorized. During the operation, an encounter occurred between federal agents and a civilian that would change the course of the night and spark days of unrest. The individual involved was later identified as Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old intensive care unit nurse who worked at a local hospital. Federal officials stated that during the encounter, agents perceived an immediate threat. An ICE agent discharged a firearm, striking Pretti. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Almost immediately, conflicting narratives emerged. Federal authorities claimed the use of force was justified, asserting that agents believed Pretti was armed and posed a danger. However, Pretti's family strongly disputed this account. They stated that he was unarmed and was using his mobile phone to record the operation. Within hours, videos circulated online that appeared to show Pretti holding a phone, not a weapon. These images fueled outrage and skepticism, especially among community members who already harbored deep mistrust toward federal immigration enforcement. As news of the shooting spread, residents began gathering near the site of the incident. What started as a vigil and peaceful protest quickly escalated. Emotions ran high. Protesters chanted slogans condemning immigration raids and police violence. By nightfall, tensions had intensified, and confrontations broke out between demonstrators and law enforcement. Authorities deployed riot police. Tear gas and chemical agents were used to disperse crowds. Fires were reported in several locations. Vehicles were damaged, storefronts vandalized, and streets blocked. The city descended into chaos, reminiscent of earlier unrest Minneapolis had experienced years before. Amid the disorder, several federal vehicles were vandalized, including at least one vehicle belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. During the break-in, government property was stolen. Most concerning to federal authorities was the reported theft of a federally issued rifle, along with ammunition and tactical equipment. This development significantly escalated the seriousness of the situation. The theft of a federal firearm is considered a major national security concern. The FBI launched an immediate investigation, releasing images and video stills of suspects and offering a substantial monetary reward for information leading to arrests. Federal officials emphasized that the stolen weapon posed a danger to the public and vowed that those responsible would be held accountable. Within days, at least one suspect was arrested and charged with theft of government property and unlawful possession of a firearm. Federal prosecutors confirmed the charges in court filings. Authorities also indicated that additional suspects had been identified, though they stopped short of confirming the exact number of arrests, cautioning against misinformation circulating on social media. As unrest continued, Minnesota's governor authorized the deployment of the National Guard to assist local law enforcement. Armored vehicles appeared on city streets. Helicopters hovered overhead. Curfews were imposed in affected areas. The visual presence of military forces in a major American city intensified the sense of crisis. National political figures quickly weighed in. Supporters of strict immigration enforcement argued that federal agents were operating under dangerous conditions and deserved support. They emphasized that attacks on law enforcement vehicles and theft of weapons could not be tolerated. Others, including civil rights advocates and progressive lawmakers, argued that the incident highlighted systemic problems with immigration raids, lack of transparency, and excessive use of force. Human rights organizations called for an independent investigation. They questioned why heavily armed federal operations were being conducted in residential neighborhoods and whether agents were adequately trained in de-escalation. They also raised concerns about accountability, noting that federal officers are often shielded from local oversight. The U.S. Department of Justice announced that it had opened a formal review of the shooting. Internal investigators were tasked with determining whether federal use of force policies were followed. Officials stressed that the investigation would take time and urged the public not to jump to conclusions. Meanwhile, Alex Pretti's family demanded justice. They described him as a dedicated healthcare worker who had spent years saving lives, including during the COVID-19 pandemic. Vigils were held in his memory. Candles, flowers, and handwritten notes filled the sidewalk near where he died. For many, his death symbolized a broader fear felt by ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire of enforcement actions. Immigrant communities across the country watched closely. Advocacy groups reported increased anxiety among undocumented families, some of whom avoided leaving their homes altogether. Community leaders warned that aggressive enforcement tactics risked undermining trust and cooperation between residents and authorities. As days passed, Minneapolis slowly returned to a fragile calm. Cleanup crews cleared debris, businesses boarded up windows, yet the underlying questions remained unresolved. Was lethal force necessary? Could the encounter have been handled differently? What safeguards exist to prevent similar tragedies? The controversy also reignited debate over the role of federal agencies operating independently of local governments. Minneapolis city officials stated they had limited involvement in the ICE operation and little control over how it was conducted. This lack of coordination raised concerns about jurisdiction, transparency, and accountability. Media coverage of the event extended far beyond the United States. International outlets framed the incident as another example of America's struggle with policing, race, and immigration. Comparisons were drawn to previous cases where civilian deaths during law enforcement operations led to widespread protests. Legal experts noted that the outcome of the investigation could have lasting implications. If wrongdoing is found, it could prompt changes to federal enforcement protocols. If agents are cleared, critics fear it may deepen public distrust. The stolen rifle investigation continued in parallel. Federal officials warned that anyone found in possession of the weapon would face severe penalties. They urged the public not to interfere and to report any information to authorities. At the heart of this unfolding story lies a profound tension. Governments have a responsibility to enforce laws. Citizens have a right to safety and due process. When those responsibilities collide, the consequences can be explosive. The Minneapolis incident is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader national conversation about how immigration laws are enforced, how power is exercised, and how lives can be irrevocably altered in moments of fear and misjudgment. As investigations continue, one truth remains clear. The impact of that night will be felt long after the streets have quieted. Families are grieving, communities are divided, trust has been shaken. America now faces a familiar crossroads. Whether this moment leads to reform, reflection, or further polarization will depend on what comes next, on transparency, accountability, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The United States is once again confronting a familiar and deeply unsettling reality. A federal law enforcement operation has ended in the death of a civilian, igniting protests, unrest, political backlash, and an ongoing national debate about immigration enforcement and the use of force. The events that unfolded in Minneapolis, Minnesota in late January have now become a defining moment, one that raises urgent questions about accountability, transparency, and the human cost of enforcement policies. According to federal authorities, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, commonly known as ICE, was conducting an immigration-related operation in a residential area of North Minneapolis. Officials have stated that the operation was lawful and carried out as part of broader federal enforcement efforts. However, what was meant to be a targeted operation quickly escalated into a deadly confrontation. During the encounter, a federal agent discharged a firearm, killing a civilian at the scene. The individual was later identified by family members as Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old healthcare worker employed as an intensive care unit nurse at a local hospital. Federal officials confirmed the death, but emphasized that an internal review and federal investigation are still ongoing. Almost immediately, sharply conflicting accounts emerged regarding what exactly happened in the moments before the shooting. Federal authorities stated that agents perceived an imminent threat and acted in self-defense. Officials claimed that the situation developed rapidly and that the agent believed the individual posed a danger. However, Pretti's family strongly disputed this account, insisting that he was unarmed and posed no threat to officers. Family members stated that Pretti was using his mobile phone to record the operation when he was shot. Videos that surfaced on social media appeared to show him holding what looked like a phone, not a weapon. These images circulated widely, fueling public outrage and skepticism, particularly among civil rights advocates and immigrant rights organizations. At the same time, federal officials cautioned against drawing conclusions from partial footage, stressing that a full investigation was necessary. As news of the shooting spread throughout Minneapolis, residents began gathering near the location of the incident. What began as a vigil and peaceful protest quickly intensified. Demonstrators demanded answers, accountability, and justice. Chants calling for an end to aggressive immigration enforcement echoed through the streets. Emotions ran high as the city grappled with yet another fatal encounter involving law enforcement. By nightfall, the situation escalated. Law enforcement agencies reported clashes between protesters and police. Authorities deployed crowd control measures, including tear gas and chemical irritants, to disperse large gatherings. Fires were reported in several areas, and some businesses and vehicles were damaged. Streets were blocked, and the city entered a state of emergency response. Amid the chaos, several federal vehicles were vandalized, including at least one vehicle belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. According to the FBI, government property was stolen from the vehicle during the unrest. Most notably, officials reported that a federally issued rifle, along with ammunition and tactical gear, had been taken. Federal authorities described this as an extremely serious breach with potential public safety implications. The FBI immediately launched a separate investigation into the theft of government weapons and property. Images and surveillance footage were released, and a substantial reward was offered for information leading to arrests. Officials warned that anyone found in possession of the stolen firearm would face severe federal charges. In the days that followed, federal prosecutors confirmed that at least one suspect had been arrested and charged in connection with the theft of government property and unlawful possession of a firearm. Authorities indicated that additional suspects had been identified, though they declined to confirm specific numbers, urging the public to rely on verified information rather than social media claims. As unrest continued, Minnesota's governor authorized the deployment of the National Guard to assist local law enforcement in restoring order. Armored vehicles, armed personnel, and aerial surveillance became a visible presence in parts of the city. Curfews were imposed, and residents were urged to remain indoors. While the streets eventually quieted, the tension did not dissipate. National political leaders quickly weighed in. Supporters of stricter immigration enforcement argued that federal agents were operating in dangerous conditions and had the right to protect themselves. They condemned the vandalism of federal vehicles and the theft of weapons, calling for harsh penalties for those responsible. On the other side, civil rights groups, immigration advocates, and several progressive lawmakers questioned the tactics used during the operation. They argued that heavily armed raids in residential neighborhoods increased the risk of deadly outcomes. Critics also pointed to a lack of transparency surrounding federal operations and the limited role local governments have in overseeing them. Human rights organizations called for an independent investigation into the shooting. They stressed that federal agents are often shielded from local accountability mechanisms and that this lack of oversight erodes public trust. Legal experts noted that determining whether the use of force was justified would depend on the findings of federal investigators and any available body camera or surveillance footage. The U.S. Department of Justice confirmed that it had opened a formal review of the incident. Officials stated that investigators would examine whether federal use of force policies were followed and whether any violations occurred. They emphasized that the process would take time and that conclusions should not be drawn prematurely. For Alex Pretti's family, the wait for answers has been agonizing. Relatives described him as a compassionate healthcare worker who dedicated his life to saving others. Vigils were held in his memory, with community members leaving candles, flowers, and messages of support near the site where he was killed. For many, his death became a symbol of fear surrounding aggressive enforcement practices. Immigrant communities across Minneapolis and beyond reported heightened anxiety. Advocacy groups stated that many undocumented families were afraid to leave their homes, fearing encounters with federal agents. Community leaders warned that such fear undermines public safety by discouraging cooperation with authorities and access to essential services. The incident also reignited broader national debates about immigration policy in the United States. Questions resurfaced about the scope of federal authority, the role of ICE, and the balance between enforcement and human rights. Critics argued that immigration enforcement should prioritize due process and de-escalation rather than militarized tactics. Local officials in Minneapolis stated that they had limited involvement in the ICE operation and little authority over how it was conducted. This raised concerns about coordination between federal agencies and local governments. Some city leaders called for greater transparency and communication to prevent similar incidents in the future. International media outlets covered the story extensively, framing it as part of America's ongoing struggle with policing, civil liberties, and immigration. Comparisons were drawn to past incidents where civilian deaths during law enforcement operations led to widespread protests and calls for reform. Legal analysts noted that the outcome of the investigation could have significant implications. If wrongdoing is found, it could prompt changes to federal enforcement protocols and training. If agents are cleared, critics fear it could deepen public mistrust and reinforce perceptions of impunity. Meanwhile, the investigation into the stolen federal weapon continued. Authorities emphasized that recovering the firearm remained a top priority. They warned that the presence of stolen government weapons in the community posed a serious risk and urged anyone with information to come forward. At its core, the Minneapolis incident highlights a fundamental tension in American society. Governments have a responsibility to enforce laws. Citizens have a right to life, safety, and due process. When those responsibilities collide, the consequences can be tragic. This was not merely a protest that turned violent. It was not just a single use-of-force incident. It was a convergence of policy, power, fear, and human vulnerability. And its impact will extend far beyond the streets of Minneapolis. As the city works to heal, many questions remain unanswered. Was lethal force unavoidable? Could the situation have been resolved differently? What safeguards exist to prevent future tragedies? For now, the nation waits for the findings of ongoing investigations. Families mourn, communities remain divided, and the debate over immigration enforcement and accountability continues. One thing is certain: the events in Minneapolis have once again forced the United States to confront uncomfortable truths about authority, justice, and the cost of enforcement. The final outcome will shape not only policy discussions, but public trust in the institutions tasked with protecting lives. This story is still unfolding, and until the full truth is known, it remains a powerful reminder of how quickly law enforcement actions can alter lives and a nation's conscience.